Good afternoon, and thank you for your participation in today's Inheritance, a Legacy Lost webinar. My name is Jackie Smith, and I am the president of the Suburban Houston Fort Bend Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated is a private, non-for-profit organization whose purpose is to provide assistance and support in local communities throughout the world. The sorority currently has 1,000 collegiate and alumni chapters located around the world. The Suburban Houston Fort Bend Alumni Chapter was chartered in 1976 as the 553rd chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated to serve communities in Missouri City and Fort Bend County. Since its inception, our chapter continues to promote and execute the five national programmatic thrusts of the sorority. These thrusts aim to maximize our impact on the community. Today's program is brought to you by our Economic Development Committee, a subcommittee of our Program Planning and Development Committee, led by our second Vice President, Lena Ellis, along with coordinators, Brianna Campbell and Deborah LeBlanc. We thank you for sharing your Saturday afternoon with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. And again, welcome to our webinar presentation. Again, I am Brianna Campbell, a chapter member and coordinator for the Economic Development Subcommittee. Today's webinar, titled Inheritance, Legacies Lost, is being presented to you in recognition of Financial Literacy Month, which happens to be in April. During Financial Literacy Month, organizations across the country conduct a variety of events and carry out initiatives designed to improve financial literacy and to promote financial well-being for all its consumers. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Michelle I. Taylor. Ms. Taylor has been practicing attorney for over 16 years. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Bennett College, her Juris Doctor degree from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. She currently serves as Associate General Counsel in the Office of the Air Force General Counsel for the Department of Defense, where she advises and provides legal support to the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for installations, environment and energy, and the Air Force Civil Engineers Center, sorry about that. Her primary areas of practice are commercial real estate, leasing, land disposal, portfolio management, and alternative dispute resolution. In addition to her duties for the Air Force General Counsel's Office, she also has her own private practice where she represents clients in estate planning, probate, real estate, small business setup, and management. She is a sought-after public speaker on the domestic and international platforms. Ladies and gentlemen, attorney Miss Michelle I. Taylor.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for that great introduction. Before we get started, I want to get something out of the way. Let me get this out of the way. I'm an Associate General Counsel working for the Department of Defense. The opinions, thoughts, and views expressed during this webinar are my own and do not reflect the views of the DoD, the United States government, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Economic Development Committee of Suburban Houston Fort Bend Alumni Chapter. The information is meant for informational purposes only and not for legal advice. Thank you. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. As this webinar gets started, wanted to kind of talk a little bit about myself and why we're doing this. I must admit that I am a history fanatic. I've always in awe for things that have come before us and for people who lived before us. So when I was asked to speak about this topic that I'm so deeply passionate about, I started to ask, what angle will I focus in on to get the information across to all of you? So to understand why estate planning is so important, I must take you on a proverbial historical walk so you can see the full picture of why it's so critical to have your affairs in order. So let us start our journey. And let's think about the main cause of the Civil War in this country. The heart of the divide was because of slavery. And because slavery built and drove America's economy, there were a lot of people dead set on keeping it exactly the way it was. The war ended on April 9th, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered the last major Confederate army to Ulysses Grant. And actually, the last battle was fought here in Texas and ended on May 13th, 1865. 5 days after the Civil War ended, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and assassinated. He died on April 15th, 1865, and then we had Vice President Andrew Johnson assume the presidency. Congress passed on January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6th, 1865, the 13th Amendment. And what did the 13th Amendment do? Abolish slavery. But there was always an exception in there, unless you were punished for a crime. Think about that and hold that thought. So we also had, during Congress passed, the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's an important agency because it helps slaves and poor free slaves and poor whites to maneuver after the Civil War in this country. So on January 12th, 1865, which is an important aspect, General William T. Sherman met with 20 ministers in Savannah, Georgia. Now, we talk about the 40 acres. Now, I know we think that's a Spike Lee production. However, 40 acres and a mule was actually started back in 1865. The idea of land came after the meeting, where the pastor said, his name was Garrison Frazier, asked for land for freed blacks. Later, Sherman agreed to loan the settlers the mule. So that's where we now have 40 acres in a mule. So one of the things that I want to talk a little bit more about, and this is the agenda for today, 40 acres in a mule, Reconstruction Not, the Great Migration. So these are things I'm going to be touching on throughout the presentation. We do have a trivia question, so I'm going to go ahead and pause for a second and hold on and let that move forward. I'm not sure who's gonna. I think that's going to be someone to do the trivia questions. I'm gonna pause for just a second.
So the first trivia question is going to be an icebreaker question. Just to get everyone familiar with answering the question, we are going to use the chat box for you to answer the question. And as a side note, if you do have a question as the presentation proceeds on, please do so. Ask your question in the Q&A box. So those are two different boxes. So we're just doing this icebreaker question to kind of just get you familiar with the way the Zoom controls work. So for this icebreaker question, here goes. In what year was the 40 acres prescribed as part of an order created by General Sherman? A, 1860, B, 1865, C, 1864, or D, 1868? I'll give you like 30 seconds for you to answer in the chat. And if you're streaming from Facebook Live, feel free to chat, put the answer in the Facebook chat as well. Awesome. A lot of people are answering. Great, great, great. So Like I said, this is the icebreaker question. We will have other trivia questions throughout the webinar. And from this point forward, any trivia that we do, the person who wins will be receiving a small token of our appreciation from the Economic Development Committee. So without further ado, the answer is B, 1865. So I see a few people that got it, actually a lot of people that got it right in the chat, and then also as well on Facebook. So there you have it. And be sure to stay tuned in, pay attention, because we have way more trivia coming for you. Michelle, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. And please bear with me. I'm making sure my Zoom, I think I'm trying to make sure I'm sharing my camera. Can you all see it? Okay, let's see. Okay. All right, perfect. Now I'm back. Thank you so much. So one of the points that, and I'm glad a lot of people got that 1865. What's really important about that is that the freed slaves did not want to be taken care of. They actually wanted to have their own land. And so that was such an important factor. So during that point, 1865 started what we call the Reconstruction era. And what was important about the Reconstruction era? Like I was telling you about the 13th, the 14th, and the 14th Amendment gave us the rights, was passed in 1866, and that further extended the Bill of Rights to former slaves. And then the 15th Amendment actually allowed Black men the right to vote, and that's really important. So Reconstruction is the restoration of the Union, transformation of Southern society, and progressive legislation for free Blacks to actually participate in our political process. So 40 acres and a mule was pretty much, we were literally on land. So I think that's important. Slaves lived on over 400,000 acres of land in Georgia. It started in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So that's really important. And the land wasn't given to them. The land was actually, it was like a small mortgage, but again, they wanted their own land to toil and do what they needed for their family. So that's an important part. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of advances during Reconstruction. We just kept moving and progressing, and it was awesome. And I think that we farmed the lands that we used to, have to farm and so forth. We did those things for ourselves. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Supreme Court, because we know that is a part of our governing body for the United States. During that time, I think a lot of people may have heard of the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case was in 1856, and that's when the justice said, hey, the Bill of Rights, I know we said they apply to you, but they really don't apply to you because we don't consider you a citizen. And there's a famous quote that I must share with the group where the Chief Justice Taney said, they had for more than a century before been regarded as being of inferior order. And although unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man were bound to respect, and the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So keep that in mind. Then the next Supreme Court case was in 1883, which was another civil rights case that mandated to end racial segregation in public accommodations. And again, that was twice in history, where it was 1875 and then again in 1964. Then we had Plessy versus Ferguson. I always say separate but unequal, but it was quote unquote separate but equal, where they said the 14th Amendment would still allow them to keep public institutions segregated. So I'm telling you the background for this. And so the next question I would ask, so why should we care? I'm glad you asked. Blacks, despite the undertone and whispers of segregation, were still making strides and moving forward and owning their own land, which was meant that they were building their wealth. So then we come along, we have the big compromise. So 1876, at that time, Republican nominee Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democratic Samuel J. Tilden. It was one of the most contentious presidential elections in history until now, I would say, that gave rise to the Compromise of 1877. Now, what is the Compromise of 1877? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's an unwritten agreement where Democrats conceded the election to Hayes in return for the end of Reconstruction and withdrawal of the federal troops from the South. That's a really pivotal point. So Reconstruction started in 1865, and we had the big compromise in 1877. And Reconstruction ended after that compromise. So I call it Reconstruction not. We were making strides, we were doing things, we were handling our business. And then next, you know, they were like so ready for us to go back to where it used to be. Again, I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, they were dead set on keeping it as, you know, what it was before. So Reconstruction was only about 12 years, which is really not a lot of time considering we were in bondage for years, hundreds of years. So just keep that in mind. So Southern Democrats said, hey, if you remove the troops from the South, we'll protect the civil and political rights of Blacks. Of course, that was not kept. And the end of federal intervention in the South led to widespread disenfranchisement of Black voters. From the late 1870s outward, Southern legislators passed a series of laws requiring segregations of whites from persons of color, public transportations in schools and parks, restaurants, theater, and other locations. We know this as the Black Code, AKA the Jim Crow laws. And, you know, you think about Jim Crow, which was a ministerial act developed in the antebellum years, where segregationist statutes governed life in the South through the middle and the next century. So why do we care? The domestic terrorism that was committed once the troops left rolled back the previous successes Blacks gained during the Reconstruction era. No more voting, owning land, and running for public office. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about, during that time I said that the domestic terrorism, political terror, Billie Holiday wrote a song and it was released called Strange Fruit in 1939. And it depicts the reason why the terrorism experienced in the South, or the terror experienced in the South by Blacks, was really focused on lynching. It says, Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scenes of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scents of magnolias sweet and fresh, then suddenly smells of burning flesh. Here is a fruit from the crow to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is strange and bitter crop. Now, Billie Holiday came under a lot of pressure not to sing that song because it shined light on what was happening in the South. So after that, we had what we call the first Great Migration. Now, what is that? A lot of people from the South, this is like a domestic, interdomestic transition from the South to the North. And it was done. I mean, Blacks were leaving the South because they were saying, go to the North, it's better in the North. And so between 1910 and really 1970, an estimated 6 million Blacks left the South and moved to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Harlem, Boston, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Washington, Newark, New Jersey. They quickly discovered, though, that the racism that they had fled from in the South was even more present also in the North, which coined the word, it became known as Up South, meaning there was really not a lot of differences between what they experienced in the South, in the North, and also in the West. So it wasn't exempt. So one of the things I want to point out is the height of Black land ownership came in 1910. And records show that more Black Americans own land than ever before in the history of the United States. Over 14 million acres of land. That is a lot of land, were owned by approximately 210 Black persons. leading some historians to refer to this period as the height of Black land ownership. That is a lot of land, and most of it was farmland, so keep that in mind. So when we think about, let me backtrack a little bit. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves. Now remember, freed slaves that were outside of the Union, so just keep that in mind, but did not provide the right to own land. Also, a lot of the acts that happened were pretty much, a lot of them were for white only. They had the Homestead Act of 1862 restricted acquisition of land in the West to white only. Also, when you think about the lack of documentation, so when I talk about land ownership, a lot of times coming out of slavery, we didn't have birth certificates. We took the name of our masters. So we didn't have adequate records to reflect who we were. So that became an issue when you're trying to document that you own said land over here. Also, a lot of the acts, the Morrill Act of 1862 offered land to white-only colleges that taught agriculture and mechanical courses. Now think about a lot of our schools, like I know North Carolina A&T is a agriculture. We have schools here that are tied to that. And so that was not given to the Black schools, it was given to white colleges. So again, another way that we were deprived of certain things. Think about sharecropping. Jim Crow policies allowed separate treatment of whites and Blacks if it was equally done, but we know what was really considered equal. Also, sharecropping became a common practice where tenants were charged high interest rates that created insurmountable debt. So you would never technically pay off your, and I'm gonna call it your master, because that's really what that ended up being. Then we have partition sales where physically divided property was among owners. So we'll get into a little bit more of that soon. So now I want to go into, like I mentioned, Black ownership and how for the last 100 years it's actually shrunk, which is really, really sad to me. We should be gaining and we're actually losing. And it's sad that 1910 was the climax of Black ownership in this country. So think about that. There's a lot of discriminatory practices, a lot of things that have kept us back from being able to do it. But I want you to keep those facts in mind as we continue on. And this is just talking about this slide here is a storefront, and this is in Atlanta, Georgia. And if you look at it, auction and Negro sales. So these are things that we continue to have to face, and this was 1864. Okay, so a dream of home ownership placed out of reach. After the Civil War, thousands of African Americans were able to gain government jobs. They were like, this is great. We can start to build our wealth as well as working. Well, once Woodrow Wilson became president, he was a racist who decided to segregate the federal government. So Blacks that were working with whites, he segregated them and said, you have to be over here, or he let them go. So again, that stifled the ability to take care of ourselves. And it attacked what we were calling the Black middle class once we had this segregation. So something to think about how, and this is a picture that is, I want to say this is in Detroit. So this is May 3rd, 1950. So I love pictures like this because I want you to see what life was like for our people in this country, because I think it's important to understand this process. Now, the creation of the suburbs and white middle class. This didn't just happen by chance. So we have the white middle class being spun up. Think about let's go back to the Depression and New Deal. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that we learned is that during this whole process, they were doing different programs that were helping Americans if you were not Black. If you were Black, you were expected to pull yourself up by your own bootstrap and do what you need to do. But most of the suburbs that were created with restrictions, and the restrictions will not allow us to live there. So keep that in mind. The changing math behind home ownership in the United States. I love this slide. Why do I love this slide? Because look at the property. In 1950, I could have bought a home for $7,400. That same home is over $200,000 in 2010. We're in 2021 now. So white families were given that higher, that one step up 2 generations of just, being able to build generational wealth through home ownership. So just look at that for a second. 1950, 7,400. And at that time, working class Black families could actually obtain that and have purchased property. And now they would have been sitting on at least 200,000 or more, depending on location, of money that they could have had. So this is a very important slide, because I want people to see what was going on at that time. So the wealth gap, we talk about, one of the things about our goal here is to explain why there's a wealth gap. What's going on? People talk about it all the time and say, well, how come the average Black family has about 17,000 in savings, while the average white family has 117,000 in savings? Well, I just explained to you with the housing, if they were able to hold on to their property, they could keep and gain and continue to strive and have wealth. So that's another thing. So Blacks or African Americans households were significantly less wealth than white households, regardless of the importance of demographic factors, because of the home ownership. That was another factor that impacted our ability to own land. All right, sorry for that little delay. I think that, and I apologize, that clip did have I was trying to go past one of the information in there, but it was really helpful to understand. And I think it explained redlining really, really well, because it not only impacts our ability to have wealth, but it impacts our education and it impacts the criminal justice. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are really being impacted by redlining. So the slides here, and I apologize, if it's back, in this. Okay, the low income housing in African American communities. The slides are showing Savannah, Georgia, as well as another portion of the country, but it was a lot of overcrowding, and it was just, you were renting, you could not own the property there. So that was another thing that impacted our ability to gain wealth. If you're renting, you will never own, and you're paying someone else's mortgage, which is a huge problem if you're trying to build wealth. And this is another example of the suburbs, and then also the area that Blacks were living in during this time. So that's another issue that we see the disparity. It is so blatant. It's not anything it's so overt and so blatant that it becomes a huge issue that we have to continually to deal with today, even though after the Fair Housing Act passed, it was supposed to end, but we know that that's not the case. I want to also play this clip. This is an important part. I'm not going to play the whole clip, but this came on last year, and I think it's imperative that we think about what this video talks about. This was on Showtime Vice. So I'm going to start this clip right now.
One of the best ways for an American family to create intergenerational wealth is to own some land. It's in high demand and they don't make it anymore. I'm standing on the beach of the beautiful island of Hilton Head, South Carolina, where after the Civil War, Black people owned most of this. But over the decades, the land was lost. And to this day, we got Black folks that are still fighting to keep their little piece of the American dream. By 1910, African Americans owned around 16 million acres of land, much of it acquired through purchases and homesteading. But after years of violence, intimidation, and legal trickery, most of it was taken. Texas A&M law professor Thomas Mitchell has been tracking that loss for 2 decades.
Historically, if we're talking about African Americans, despite this incredible acquisition of land after the Civil War, most of that property was not considered prime real estate. For example, Hilton Head, South Carolina. Until 1950, Hilton Head was remote. There wasn't a bridge from the South Carolina mainland out to Hilton Head Island, and the island was owned by majority African Americans.
Right.
What does South Carolina do? They build a bridge. Real estate developers realize, oh, there's a great economic opportunity, and they have divisions of what has become Hilton Head.
The indigo, rice, and long staple cotton of the past have given way to the golf, tennis, and swimming of today's leisure society.
They started buying out individual families, and there's hardly any Black landowners left. And what's just happened as our society has advanced. Areas that were once considered the backwaters no longer are the backwaters.
We're on a mission right now to get this tangerine. The vulnerability of Black land isn't limited to the coastlines. It's widespread throughout the United States, even in my hometown of Tallahassee. Sandra Thompson learned just how hard it can be to maintain possession of land that developers want to get their hands on. I remember growing up in Tallahassee. This was the sticks. I went to school with people that lived out here. We'd be like, you live in the boonies, in the boondocks.
It's actually now zoned urban fringe.
Urban fringe.
Urban fringe.
People try to buy it.
All the time.
Sandra's family were sharecroppers on this land. Her grandparents bought it in 1946 using money their son made serving in the military. But their will didn't clearly identify a single person who would inherit and manage the property.
When my grandmother passed away, it was left equally to her descendants. So that essentially created heirs property.
Heirs property. On the most basic level, what is it?
Heirs property is communal type property where your ancestors would have purchased the land, and once they passed away, it transfers to the next generation and their descendants. It's fractional ownership, a property that could be owned by 200 people. Any one of those heirs could sell their percentage. That new owner can go to the court and say, well, we can't agree on how to manage this land.
And force the rest of the folk to sell it even if they don't want to?
Yes. And so it was essential for us to move it out of heirs property status. And that process costs from probate to title clearing close to about $10,000.
Wait, so you own the land, but then you had to pay $10,000 to own the land again?
Exactly. Because of the cost, a lot of families don't clear title to their property. And so then it keeps them in a vulnerable economic risk position.
African Americans disproportionately own heirs property that every lawyer who was knowledgeable about this ownership form would tell them, run away. Do not ever own it under this structure. And so you're having a population sitting in this very vulnerable way, and oftentimes in a way that they don't understand how the law operates, sometimes until a lawsuit is filed.
The land been in our family for at least 125 years. Started with my great-grandfather. The land is, for me, a lot of memories, part of my roots. I was proud of the name Lewis. We worked to have something. And I guess we'll say we lost it.
The Lewis family owned 480 acres of land and a homestead in northern Louisiana. Because the land was heirs property, several distant family members were able to sell their share of it to a local timber developer named James Tuggle. Tuggle forced the sale of the land that happened last year.
My great-great-grandfather raised 13 kids where that house sits. I mean, there are so many heirs tied into the Lewis properties, it'll make your head spin. Taxes were always paid on time. We were under the impression that could no one person from the family just up and sell any part of the property without anyone being notified.
Do you all know the relatives that sold their part?
I've only seen one once.
You in New York, wherever, going on with your life, you don't really know nothing about this little country spot right here. You don't know nothing about this here.
As part of the legal process, the forced sale of heirs property has to be publicly announced. In the Lewis's situation, a local newspaper posted a notice in the weeks leading up to the auction.
This is a small town. Okay, this is not like the Washington Post or New York Journal or whatever, you know. There's no paper out here in the country that's being delivered to the doorstep. You know, ain't no ball riding no bicycle throwing no paper on the front porch down here.
Okay, so this video is extremely important. This came out last year, but it talks about airship property and how a lot of us are losing our land due to people moving away, people dying, and not necessarily having their stuff in order. And then it becomes so fragmented that you have 200, 300 people sometimes. If people continue to multiply and people die, it just becomes a mess. And so this family who owned their property for 125 years in Louisiana lost it so easily because people who had moved away the guy contacted them and sold their property directly to them. And he forced the other parties who were living on the land to sell that land. So this is something that's extremely important and it's actually happening. But there is a law. It's actually in 9 states right now where it's called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, where the heirs, if in fact someone wants to sell their portion, they must give the people who are definitely living on the land who want to keep the land an opportunity to have notice and an opportunity to be able to purchase their share of that land so that this situation will not occur. But it's only in 9 states and it's not retroactive, which means that it doesn't go backwards. It only goes moving forward, but it's only in 9 states thus far. So that's a really important point of how we're losing our land. I'm going to the next slide. And this is the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. And again, this is only in 9 states thus far. Now, another point when we talk about, this is what we've been talking about, the forgotten history of the government segregating segregating us and how we're living in America. So this is another one that I want you guys to listen to because I want to talk a little bit more about this, but it's laying the background for it. So hold on one second.
This is the day in 1954 that the Supreme Court issued its famous ruling desegregating schools, Brown versus Board of Education. Today, schools remain largely segregated, and the author Richard Rothstein argues that's because housing is segregated. Even today, Black and white people generally don't live in the same neighborhoods. Rothstein's new book is called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So the basic argument of your book is that while racist individuals might have contributed to housing segregation in specific cases, there was an overwhelming amount of government policy at the state, local, and federal level that explicitly forced Black people to live in different places from white people. And I have to admit that reading this book, the geographic scope, the longevity, the sheer creativity of these policies really took me by surprise.
It takes many people by surprise. This whole history has been forgotten. It used to be well known. There was nothing hidden about it. The federal government pursued 2 important policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. The second program that the federal government pursued was to subsidize the development of suburbs on a condition that they be only sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. These 2 policies worked together to segregate metropolitan areas in ways that they otherwise would never have been segregated.
The book gives so many different examples of how this played out, and one of the worst offenders is the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. Explain why this one government agency has so much influence over where people live and what the FHA did to prevent Black people from buying and owning homes.
Perhaps the best known example is Levittown, just east of New York City, but there were subdivisions like this all over the country. What the federal government did in the 1940s and 50s, it came to a developer like Levitt, the Levitt family that built Levittown. That family could never have assembled the capital necessary to build 17,000 homes on its own. What the federal government did, the FHA, is guarantee bank loans for construction and development to Levittown on condition that no homes be sold to African Americans and that every home have a clause in its deed prohibiting resale to African Americans.
The FHA policies here were not merely incentives or encouragements. You tell the story of progressive, idealistic developers who wanted to build integrated housing communities and were absolutely unable to do so. And we're not just talking about in the Deep South here.
We're not talking about the Deep South at all. We're talking of the North, the West, the Midwest. The great American novelist Wallace Stegner got a job right after World War II at Stanford University There was an enormous civilian housing shortage. He joined and helped to lead a cooperative of 400 families who bought a large tract outside Stanford University where they wanted to build single-family homes. The FHA refused to insure those homes, refused to provide the capital for construction because the 400-member cooperative had 3 African-American members. The cooperative tried to resist the FHA's demand, promising the FHA that the number of African Americans in the cooperative wouldn't exceed the percentage of African Americans in California as a whole. The FHA refused that compromise. Finally, the cooperative had to disband because they couldn't go ahead with the project. They sold the land to a private developer who, with FHA guarantees, built single-family homes with racially exclusive deeds.
Your book also explains one way in which Black neighborhoods became undesirable. You describe zoning laws in which Black parts of town were officially zoned for industrial plants, waste disposal, other things that we would consider a blight. And meanwhile, those businesses were explicitly kept out of white neighborhoods in the same cities.
Yes, there are examples in St. Louis and Los Angeles, neighborhoods that once they had African American residents were rezoned to permit industrial and toxic uses. Those rezonings turned those neighborhoods into slums. White families outside those neighborhoods looked upon the neighborhoods, saw slums, and concluded that African Americans were slum dwellers and that they moved into their neighborhoods, into the white neighborhoods, they would bring those conditions with them.
Why were all of these policies put in place? Was it just overt racism on the part of policymakers? What actually was the motivation?
Well, that's very hard to know, and one thing that should be remembered is that it can't be blamed simply on the standards of the time, because there were people who dissented. People did know better, but they had other priorities, and they caved in to a private prejudice in some of their constituents. They themselves were prejudiced. It was assumptions about racial superiority, but it also was cowardice in not confronting popular views about racial superiority.
So as you lay out this history, these segregationist, discriminatory, harmful structures were built over the first half of the 20th century. And then Congress passes the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which says many of those practices were illegal, unconstitutional, and they stop, for the most part, the worst ones. Why doesn't that solve the problem?
Well, because all the Fair Housing Act could do was prohibit future discrimination. But by the time the Fair Housing Act was passed, the patterns of segregation had been firmly established. Simply passing a Fair Housing Act did not enable African Americans who were previously living in urban areas to relocate to the suburbs from which they'd been excluded. I gave the example earlier of Levittown in 1947-48, when those homes were built with a racially restrictive policy.
This is the day in
Okay, so getting back to that point, I just wanted to stop it right there. We talked about that earlier. So what he was about to say is that the homes that were $7,400 are now $200,000+. So again, because of these types of policies, we were not able to acquire the wealth. We were not able to live in the suburbs. So that was another thing and another factor that has impacted our ability to have wealth.
This is the day.
So going to the next. Okay, this is our second trivia question. I'm going to let the person who will be asking that question take a hold. Go right ahead, Ms. Hines.
Hello, I hope everyone is enjoying this very informative webinar. It's amazing. So trivia question number 2 is actually geared towards the audience that is on the webinar. And the question is, how long did the Reconstruction last? A, 25 years, B, 7 years, C, 15 years, or D, 12 years? And I see responses are coming in quickly. They're coming in quickly. So we'll give you another about 10 seconds just to make sure. And also just to let you know, all of the winners will be contacted at the end of the webinar as well. And feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We will address those very shortly as well once we get started with the question and answer portion of the event. Okay, are you all ready for the answer? You ready? All right, so the answer to question how long did the reconstruction last is D, 12 years. So congratulations to our winner.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. Again, we talked about Reconstruction. We talked about how quickly it went. It started in 1865 and ended in 1877. So 12 short years that we were able to make a lot of strides. So coming forward, as we talked about, I want to talk about a little bit more about de facto and de jure segregation. What's the difference? So de jure segregation is created and enforced by law, but a de facto segregation means, in fact, occurs as a matter of factual circumstances or personal choice. And I think that's another point. The suburbs, I think when we had a slide previously that talked about, the previous slide talked about how people had a choice. Like, we want white tenants in our community, not necessarily Black tenants. So these are some factors that have impacted our ability to move into suburbs and to acquire more wealth and to live in the inner cities where it was constructed. I mean, we want to talk a little bit about the projects and how they were constructed to keep us on one side of the tracks and keep others on the other side of the tracks, which impacted our ability for education, and it impacted our ability to have upward mobility, which is why we're in the situation that we are now with the wealth, being able to have generational wealth. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about, we talked about the zoning. So I want to give an example. Sometimes when Blacks were able to purchase property in suburbs and they did not know that that the purchasers were Black, what would happen is the city would sometimes either, if they're trying to build, if it was a builder, they would make the fees like 10 times more than the regular fees would be. They would say it's only, you can't sell to, there's a particular example in the color of law where a white couple sold to a Black couple, and the people in that neighborhood attacked the white couple, and he actually went to jail for selling to a Black couple. And I thought that was really, really crazy, but that shows you how deeply rooted this type of segregation was, meaning trying to keep us out. And so we had also, I've seen where you're walking in a community, you're like, well, why is there a park in the middle of, and it's because a lot of times when people were purchasing the land, they would just condemn it and say, we're going to do a public park. So these are things that people would do in order to keep people of color out of their neighborhood. So it was very organized, it was strategic, and it was deliberate. So these are things that, we are seeing throughout. And again, the federal loan, one of the things that the color law talks about, and we know in history, is that they would say, hey, Black people, because you have the areas that we consider blighted or at risky, so you couldn't get a loan. So you end up getting a lot of times what we call a contract for deed. It's a contract for deed. A contract for deed is where you pay someone, you pay the owner a certain amount of money each month. It's kind of like a rent to own. The problem with that is that you don't gain any equity, and you don't have ability to if you wanted to borrow against your home or anything like that. And if you ever make an error on that contract for deed, meaning you don't pay something or you lose all of your money, your investment is lost. So they're very risky, and they don't allow you to accumulate wealth. So that's another concern that we saw or have seen over the years in dealing with land, and also with the covenants and restricted covenants. I have a deed right now where it says the only restriction, and this is Houston Heights area, and it was 1939. The only restriction that they had is that they could not sell the lots to Negroes. So that's something to think about. Again, this is 1939. That wasn't that long ago. All right, so why should we care? We're at that again. I hope that hope that it's starting to come together why we should care. Because when this started in the 1800s, and we're now in 2021, and we're still seeing these types of situations, the reason why we should care is because it's impacting our ability to get to the next level. So that's why we should care about how this is happening. So now I hope that all of the information that you've gotten thus far can give you an overview of the importance of owning your own and actually making sure you take care of that. So now we're on the estate planning side of it. So, okay. So what is an estate. I hear people say all the time, I don't have anything. What is an estate? So let's talk about your tangible personal property, like your furniture, your jewelry, your photos, your automobiles. That's your tangible personal property. Your intangible, like your checking accounts, your savings accounts, insurance policies, your financial investments. Also real property, your land, your house, your investment properties. That's your estate. Okay, what is an estate plan? That means you sit down and say, okay, I know, and I always tell people, we're not going to get out of this alive. So we have to figure out who will come behind us and how will we want our stuff situated. Some people, I ask questions like, okay, do you want to be cremated? You may not want to be. You may want to have a burial. So these are things that you're making gifts, you're buying insurance, you're creating wills, you're also getting stuff done. So while you're here, people know what it is that you're looking for and what you want when you're not able to speak for yourself. Okay, so got to go to the Bible because I think it's important. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it is established. Hebrews 9:16. So God is saying we need to make sure we have our stuff in order. That's so important, very important. So let's talk about our capacity. Because sometimes people say to me, what's the legal capacity? What's going on? What's a physical disability? If a person has a physical disability, that does not mean that they can't execute a document. But mental capacity, you have to make sure that you're not telling me that Roosevelt is still the president when we're doing, we're executing your documents. You need to know what's going on, who is the president. You need to have a clear presence of mind. And that's why your witnesses are also important to make sure that they recognize, okay, on this day, Ms. Hines is a right mind. She understands, she knows who she is. She knows she's executing documents. It's really, really important to make sure that people have the best mental capacity. And it's a little tricky sometimes because we know as you get older, sometimes you get forgetful, but if you're lucid and you understand on that particular day, that's good. Now, if you're not, then it's a whole nother process and it's a lot more expensive when you prepare and not in a reactive state, you can get things done so much easier. Okay, so in Texas, the capacity requirements for legal documents. Mental capacity is a complex concept and it's not easily black and white. And that's what I was saying earlier, that a senior with some form of cognitive decline may experience moments of lucid. When you're lucid, during which time they can be legally competent to do what they need to do for their documents. So again, that's why with a last will and testament, we say, we are executing a will. Do you know that you're executing your will? We kind of ask these questions to make sure the person understands what's going on. Again, the testator must have the natural object of their bound. They need to know like who their spouses are, their children are. They must be comprehensive of the kind of character of property. I have 10 homes, I have 1 home. They need to understand that. The testator must understand the nature of the effects of the act, and they must be able to make a disposition of their property according to the plan formed in their mind. That's important, especially when people can try to contest your estate. So that's important to know that you know what you're doing at the time. Last will and testament. What are the requirements of a valid will in Texas? That's a really good point. Because it's a legal document. And I think a lot of times people say, well, I'm going to just do whatever. Sometimes the cheapest is the cost the most eventually. So one of my good friends who's a lawyer said to me that he was trying to probate a will where the testator did not sign it. And I said, what do you mean? The son said, well, my father didn't know he was a testator. That's what we call the person who's executing a will. So that's why I think it's important to be able to, make sure you get legal counsel to tell you and walk you through this process. So let's go down. So legal capacity. One of the requirements of a valid will in Texas is that the testator has legal capacity. You have legal capacity to make a will if you're 18 years or older, have been lawfully married, or a member of the armed forces in the United States. And then it talks about sound mind, which I talked a little bit about earlier. You can't tell me that Eisenhower is the president and say you want to execute a will today. It's not going to work. When you're making your will, the effects of a will, you need to know what you have, the bounds of your property, and the elements of it. So it's important to know what I own. I know I own 1 home and I have a rental property, whatever that case may be. You need to know what your wishes are. And then the formalities. We talk about we make sure that we have 2 witnesses so they can do a prove up affidavit so that we don't have to go to court down the line and say we have to bring those witnesses in if we do a self-proving affidavit. So that's an important factor when we're doing a will in Texas. Texas recognizes these types of written will. Now, a holographic will, we know recently that Larry King wrote a holographic will, but now his wife is contesting it because they were not divorced. So that's another point. That's a handwritten will. And a lot of times handwritten wills, it has to be solely in the testator's handwriting. It has to be, it has to list certain things, but we don't allow, like he has a $2 million estate that went through, that would have gone through the will process. And so I think they're going to contest that. So be careful with handwritten wills. One of the statute also talks about, we talked about self-proving affidavit and just different requirements that are required to have a will. I need to keep up with my slides here. Okay, so a holographic will is what I was mentioning, an attested will. And it's, again, is a will that is not completely in the handwriting of the testator. It's usually typewritten, which is a lot of times when I draft wills, it's typewritten, and then you sign it. And then again, the benefit of a self-proving affidavit, that means you don't have to bring your witnesses to court when the will is probated. And if a will does not meet all legal requirements, the court can be declared invalid, which means the intestacy is what happens. So let's compare the will to trust. Will takes effect at death, passes through probate, and is an executor or executress, public information. Trust can be applied during life or in death, but you also have to have something that fuels the trust. Doesn't pass through trust probate. You have a trustee. Information is private unless it's challenged or disputed, and a trust may cost more to prepare due to complexity. So that's something people come to me all the time. I need a trust, I need a trust. And when I start saying, do you own your home? You know, I start asking specific questions and they may not necessarily have that. So it's always good to talk to someone about it because you may not need what you think you need. So good point. Okay, let's talk about this. This is one of the bigger issues. What happens when you die without a will or the court says your will is invalid? Ooh, this is a big one. And I want everyone to really listen to this. The law gives you the freedom to make a will that distributes your property. But if you don't do that, the law also makes a way for your property to be distributed upon your death. So that's important. This clip art is like, rest in peace. Someone's grabbing, over, because people start to act a little funny when someone dies and they think, oh, I should get something. Okay, so let's talk about who inherits when a single person with no children dies without a will in Texas. If you're single and you die without a will, your property will be distributed as follows. Your estate will pass equally to your parents if both are living. If one parent has died and you don't have siblings, it'll pass to your surviving parent. However, if you do have siblings or descendants of siblings, nieces, nephews, then your surviving parents would receive 1/2 of your estate. The remaining 1/2 would be divided among your siblings and their descendants. All of your estate would be passed to your siblings or their descendants if you have no surviving parents. So if you're single, no children, not, obviously not married, then it would go to your parents, and you have no siblings, it would go directly to your parents. If one side of your family has died out, the surviving side of the family would inherit the entire estate. Because I think sometimes I hear, well, doesn't a state get it? Well, the state has layers in which they put things in to make sure that someone in your family will inherit. Now, if there's nobody left, then it goes back to the state. But that's after they've exhausted as much as they can. And perhaps you have a close friend you want to share your estate with that would not be possible without a will. So that's another good point. People say all the time, before we get to the trivia question, people say all the time that I want to pass this down to my stepchild who I did not adopt, but they're my stepchild and I love them, but my biological child haven't seen them in years. Well, you die without a will, that's not going to happen. So I'm going to pause now and we have trivia question number 3. So I'm going to let the person who will do that chime in. Thank you.
All right, very good. This is such great information. And I am learning a lot about it. So I'm going to do trivia question number 3, and we want our Facebook Live users to answer this question, okay? So the question is, what percentage of Americans do not have a will? Is it A, 75%, B, 45%, C, 60%, or D, 35%? The question is, what percentage of Americans do not have a will? And we're going to ask our Facebook Live viewers to answer that question. And we will be looking for your answer. We'll give you just a couple seconds. %, 45%, 60%, or 35% of Americans do not have a will. Let's see what we got here. I'm looking for some answers. Okay, we have our first Facebook Live user who answered the question. Looks like it is, hang on, I'm trying to get to the name. The first person who answered 75%. No, the answer is 60%. Let's see if anybody put 60. Yes, we do have a winner with the 60%. That is Miss Lou Gould. She was the first one to answer 60%. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Boone. Okay, so that is great. 60% of Americans do not have a will, so that's a big percentage. All right, so let's talk about community property. Community property, Texas is a community property state. So the presumption is if you have a house and you're married, that's your house, meaning you and your husband or your partner, that's your property together. However, we know that that's not always the case. If you die without a will, and the caveat is, and you have outside children, meaning that this is your second marriage and you both have children, what happens is that will go to your spouse will get that 50% because that's what they're entitled to, but your 50% will go to your children and they will split it. If it's 4 kids, they get 1/4, 3 kids, 1/3. It goes that way. So that's a lot that can become a issue when you're married and you're like, wait a minute, I don't get the whole house. You don't, not when a person dies without a will. So that's an important factor. And I find that in my practice a lot, it becomes an issue. So the presumption is it's community property again, but there's certain caveats. If in fact you have previous children and you don't have a will, your kids will come in. Okay, separate property. Separate property is property that you own before marriage or acquire even during marriage by gift or inheritance. The intestate distribution formula is different for separate property. So think about this, and I always want to stress this. Your inheritance is your inheritance. Your spouse does not share in that in the state of Texas and other states as well, but we're talking Texas specific. So what happens with that? That means if you, for example, purchased a home before you got married, and then you got married, that home is still your sole separate property. Now, there is a way you can convert that property from separate property to community property, but it's a process. You have to do an affidavit, you have to do a deed. It's a process, but it can be done. However, if in fact you never do it, then that means if you have kids, then your spouse will get a life estate, meaning that they can live in the home, but they'll never own that property because it's your inherited property or is your separate property for marriage. So it's important that you kind of know how your property is configured, and you have to write a will so that people know what's going to happen to the property. If you want the freedom to decide how and whom your property will be distributed when you die, you need a will. That's an important factor. Okay, so inheritance. I mean, it's financial. There's so many different things that happen. And there's so many emotions that happen when a person passes away or when a person's about to pass away. So, I mean, there's bequeathment, there's gifts, it's property, it's just so much happening. And that's why when I saw this, I said, this is perfect because there's just so much that that we have to deal with. So steps of receiving an inheritance. Now, you got to first find the documents. I know a lot of times people don't realize if you're a pack rat, and people can't find it. And I always tell people I took my reading class in college and felt it every time. I don't know what you're thinking. You have to share it with someone. I know we can be very secretive in how we handle things, but we need to let people know where our stuff is located so that we can hopefully someone knows where to put their hand on something when something happens. If you have a will, then you have a executor or executress. We have to go through the probate process. We have to value what your estate is. We have to pay your last, we have to pay your medical bills and things like that nature with the assets. And when I say pay your medical bills, let me be clear. If you have insurance, you go through insurance, but if there's a copay or something like that, but then also there may be other bills that need to be paid, because remember, your lights, your water, all that stuff continues to happen even when you're deceased. So, and then we have to file a final tax return. We have to open up an account, but we have to make sure your will is valid. So we have to go through the whole probate process. And then after everything is taken care of, the descendants will get what the heirs will get what you have left over. What happens during the probates are, authenticating the will, getting everything set up in court, and hopefully not having any issues. If it's a will and it's valid, it's in and out. But when there's problems where there's not a will or people are contesting the will, it's further delayed and it costs money. So I'm going to give some more examples. And I know we're kind of running out of time. I look at Prince as a perfect example of someone who passed away without a will. And I mean, people are fighting over his estate because it's a multi-million-dollar estate. And it's not just about his money, but remember, Prince has music that has not even been released yet. So that's future money there that people are fighting over. I always have a little joke there. I can't believe she left everything to the stupid parakeet. So you never know what however people want to leave their property to, that's their business. But again, we have to be mindful of the fact that if someone has a will, we have to respect their wishes. So I'm going to give a couple examples of some real life examples of people that I've experienced or people who asked me to share their stories so that we know, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay. So I kind of talked a little bit about second marriages. One of my colleagues shared this with me, and I think it's a really good point. A husband and wife built their dream home, second marriages. And so their house is over 500,000. They're loving it. They're living life and they're enjoying it. Now he made sure his accounts and everything had her on it. He forgot to do a will. His two children did not like the wife. And when he died, and this started, I'm gonna give you an example. This started in 2016. It ended this year. They went through mediation, and this woman had to come off $282,000 in order to stay in her dream home because they wanted their money now. They wanted her to pay them their inheritance now. So that's a good point, and I'm sure that that's not what his intent was, but that is what happened. Also, I want to talk a little bit about divorce. If you are divorced and you have minor children, think about this for a second. If you die without a will, your spouse, your ex-spouse, let me be clear, your ex-spouse will automatically get custody of your children unless that person's proven unfit. But your money will go with the children. So if you intend to not have your ex-spouse handle your money for your children, then you need to put a estate plan in place so that does not occur. But if you die without a will, best believe your children and your ex-spouse will have your money, and it may not be in the manner in which you want it for your children. So keep that in mind. I think a lot of times people don't change up and update things, and that becomes a problem. Another situation where my client asked me to share her story. Her father died at the age of 54. He lived in over a $500,000 house. He was very successful in his years, but died without a will with a minor child. So the problem is now we have to do a dependent administration because the court looks very closely at situations where there's minors to make sure that they're not left out. And so throughout this whole process, there's still mortgage payments due, there's late fees, there's all kinds of things happening. And now I just did an application to return the property to the lender. So that means that $500,000 house that we could have sold, and that could have been a part of their inheritance, is now an inheritance loss. So we have to be very, very careful that, at 54, he thought, I'm not going to die. Unfortunately, he did. And now his children, really his eldest child, is trying to handle this, and it's a lot. So these are examples of what can happen. And then also I want to give an example of kill me not. If you kill someone and expect to inherit from them, the law doesn't give you that ability. So I call it kill me not. So that means that it's called the Slayer rule, and you can inherit, but if you have children, those kids can inherit, but you will look as though the law will look as though you predeceased that person that you took out. So keep that in mind. And also, if there's any debts to the estate, you don't personally have to pay them out of your pocket. Those debts you have to look towards the estate now to pay those debts. Do not pay debts out of your pocket. Just keep that in mind. And current affairs, there are two things that are in the news right now. There's the Bruce Beach. You can look that up. It's in Manhattan Beach in California. The property was purchased in 1912 for $12.25. And it was taken away. It was a Black beach. They opened a resort kind of for Black people at that time. Whites were pissed. They were harassing the Blacks. They were flattening people's tires, burning down things. And finally, the city came in and stepped in and did eminent domain, took the land from the family, and they paid them just compensation, like $14,000. That same, those two parcels today are worth $75 million. So keep that in mind when we talk about legacies lost, how that impacted that family. And now they're trying to right the wrong that was done during the Jim Crow era. So it's really important as we talk about the importance of estate planning. When you have everything in order, that will help your family to be able to move past certain things and gain wealth. And one more fun fact, I was reading up on Percy Robert Miller, aka Master P. I was impressed by him because when he took a $10,000 inheritance and turned it into a multi-million-dollar empire. But what also inspired me about reading about him is that everyone who signed with his record label, he gave them a deed with their name on it, and they bought houses on the golf course in Baton Rouge. And unfortunately, they encountered a lot of racism, even burning across from their land. But the point is, he had a vision and he made sure his artists had a deed with their name on it. That's an important factor. So my final words is that land is the only thing that you can buy that continues to grow. It never goes to zero. Blacks are always expected to make their own way in a regime of systematic racism, when the best minds in this country tried to preserve the culture of inferiority and slavery. We have to stay woke. We have to plan and prepare. And even in this pandemic time, we know there's a lot of uncertainty. Land is a way to have generational wealth and for your children's 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 children. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that informative webinar. We do have quite a number of questions. Before we go ahead and end the event, everyone should have a survey that popped up. If you could rate, if you are on the Zoom call, and those that are on Facebook, feel free to also go to the link. We will also provide a link for you to also provide a feedback on your experience today. So we had a couple questions, and there, the most recent one, there was, we only have time for a couple of questions. So I believe someone was asking for some clarification. Did you mention that there is a final tax return that must be paid upon your death?
Yes. Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, that's a great point. You do have to file, if that person was working and had any type of income, there is a final tax return that they must file with the estate. That is correct. And it's filed under, you have to get a EIN number from the IRS, because remember, once you pass away, it is no longer it's no longer Michelle Taylor, it's the estate of Michelle Taylor. So it is definitely, yes, you have to file a tax return.
Okay, excellent. And the next question is, how does the court validate a will, and how long does this process take?
Great question. The court, well, once you submit the filing, it just depends on the court, but usually it takes roughly about maybe 20 days or so. And then once they come back and they have to do a publication. And once that publication is done, then you can request to go before the court. And then the court will say, is this the will? And they ask the executor, are you aware that, are there any other wills? Have they ever revoked the will? And once they say no, everything is good, then the court will validate the will. And then you have 90 days. I think it's important to know an executor has 90 days to be able to complete what is needed. And if there's more time needed, then you have to go back to the court and ask.
Okay, excellent. And do you need an original will for it to be executed?
That's a great question. It just depends. You can probate a copy. It's a headache though, because if you don't have the original, then the presumption is that someone maybe destroyed that will, meaning they may have wanted to not use that will anymore. So the presumption is the original is better, but if you can show that it was lost or, then yeah, you can probate a copy. It's a very special circumstance under that for that.
Okay, and our final question for the day, it was actually in relation to the slide that was on the dream of home ownership slide. And the question is, what happened to the lots of land that were given to former slaves by former white masters?
Well, actually, good question. It wasn't actually given by the former masters. Remember, after the Civil War, they had lost that land because they left the Union. So that land was actually government land that was taken from the white slave owners, and then it was given to the blacks. But after Johnson got into, once he became president, after Abraham Lincoln was killed or murdered, he took all that back. He gave it back to the Southerners, and so blacks only were on that land for 3 years, and then they were taken off. They lost the land.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for answering all of our questions. I believe everyone was extremely engaged. I will go ahead and turn it over to the committee lead, Brianna Campbell. Excuse me.
All right, next slide, please. We are up at trivia question number 4. And so this question, we will be pulling the winner from the webinar participants. And then at the end of, once we get the winner for this trivia question, I will re-announce all the winners for the trivia questions. So for trivia question number 4, in Texas, what is it called when a person dies without a will? A, probate, B, intestate, C, testate, and D, testamentary. So I will give everyone a quick second to answer that. And also, for the Facebook live viewers, please feel free to answer it as well. We want everyone to participate. We're just directing the winners for these questions, that's all, but definitely still participate. Wow, getting a lot of responses. All right, so it looks like, so just so everyone knows, the answer is B, intestate. So, and the winner from this one is, looks to be Misty Williams. So just to review all of the winners from trivia 2, 3, and 4. So for trivia 2, our winner was Carvalyn McKellen. Trivia 3, our winner was, this was a mistake. We didn't see the first person that actually responded. So the actual winner for trivia 3 was Joyce Ogenride, and please forgive me if I butchered that, but you are the official winner for trivia 3. And of course, as I just mentioned, the winner for trivia 4 is Misty Williams. So we will be contacting you via email to get your email address, and we will be mailing you some prizes that will include a book that will a will book that allows you to put all of your information in there just in case something happens, and your family members or your loved ones will know what to do. Next slide, please. So on behalf of the Economic Development Committee, I would like to invite everyone to our next chapter event, which is the virtual town hall clearing the pathway through the pandemic in Fort Bend County. That is taking place on April 21st at 6:30 p.m. And the link is shown for you to register. And if you log off here and you still don't know where to register, if you're interested, always feel free to go to our website. And also, we post this on our Facebook pages and our Instagram pages. So with that said, on behalf of the Economic Development Subcommittee of the Suburban Houston Fort Bend Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, we would like to thank you for attending this presentation. Remember, a poll will be sent to all who registered. Please take a few moments to answer the questions. It helps us improve our programming. If you have any further questions about this program, please email us at ed.shfbac@gmail.com. If you have general questions regarding the chapter's activities, please email info@shfbac.org, and that information is on the screen. So until next time, everyone have a great evening.